So as Harold said, my name is Wayne Collier. I'm the Industry Capability Manager for the LEP, and I work in the areas mainly market access and regulation. So today, what I've been asked to cover is talk about regulation, what it means to livestock export, and what we try and do to maximise the positive benefits and minimise the negative impacts. So, look, what does regulation mean for live export? Fundamentally, first and foremost, it facilitates trade. And it does that by enabling market access through protocols, providing the confidence and the assurances to our customers to import our products through certification, and by setting the standards and the systems that provide the community and customers with the confidence that their expectations are being met. And that, of course, falls in that animal welfare space with the Australian Standards for the Export of Livestock and ESCAS. But the other part, obviously, as well, is that with that facilitation of trade, regulation brings costs, it brings burden, it distorts markets, it changes how things operate. And of course, that's the point, you're trying to affect behavioural change. But the impacts can be significant, and just with ESCAS, in our Productivity Commission submission earlier this year, we estimated that the direct costs were around about $23 million a year. And that's a significant amount. And of course, some of those are necessary and some are unnecessary. So it's not, there is always a cost. But when those costs and those regulatory obligations aren't comparable across your competitors, it takes away your competitiveness, and you do have to incorporate that elsewhere in the structures and make that up. And you see that in the live export, Tim touched on earlier the competitiveness in the meat industry. The live export industry is the same, and we're seeing a lot of very serious competition from countries like Europe, from South America, things like that. So the other part of livestock export, of course, is that there's lots of regulations. All parts of the supply chain, from production all the way through to processing, are covered by some sort of regulation. It covers vets, it covers vessels, it covers registered premises, facilities, exporters. So, I guess to give an example of the extent, for a wether from Western Australia to travel to Kuwait for processing, it'll have to meet at least 200 standards along the way, from 10 or more regulations. And then on top of that, you also have state regulation. Of course, that increases the complexity. So when you're dealing with that, there's a lot of things that come in there. And what you see is that when you have that much regulation, it affects you at the operational level quite quickly, particularly when there's issues or like inconsistency or ambiguities, or there are things that don't seem to be contributing to the actual outcome that you're trying to achieve. And those things can be the difference between a shipment being profitable and a shipment not being profitable, particularly if they're unpredictable things like ambiguity. And I suppose, a couple of straightforward examples, we have ACIL, we also have National Land Transport Standards. They both have transport standards for trucking. They're not necessarily consistent, they're duplicative, and that takes a process to change. You have registered premise or quarantine registration at the Commonwealth level, but you also have NFAS. And so if you're looking at how those interact, that's another thing that you have to navigate. You obviously have duplication in ESCAS audits due to the structure at the moment. And in the past, we've had lots of duplication in consignment assessments as well. And these things add to confusion and don't support compliance down the chain. So obviously, we have regulation that facilitates trade, but there's a trade-off. And so the important thing is to try and find ways to minimise those negative impacts. And there's a couple of ways you do that. And you do that by applying good principles of regulation, structuring it in a way that works the best possible way to minimise those impacts. So you have clearly defined objectives, that are clearly communicated all the way down the chain to everyone who needs to comply. You have obligations and responsibilities that are well understood and that target the objective. They're not targeting anything peripheral. They're on the problem you're trying to solve. And they have expectations that are reasonable and achievable. And this is an important one, of course, because I think it's a fundamental thing of fairness, You're never going to engage well with something if the task you set is something you can't achieve. I've got the line there, zero risk is only achieved by zero activity. But that doesn't achieve what you want the regulation to do. That's not why the regulation is there. So you need to find a way to make that work. And that's where the flags are always absolutes. Absolutes usually flag something that's not reasonably achievable. And there's examples where this works. You know, approved arrangements in the live export space have come in over the last couple of years with the Department of Agriculture bringing them in. But prior to that, we had a duplicative assessment process for each consignment where there were desktop audits conducted for every single consignment, yet the protocol conditions, the ASIL requirements, they didn't change. So the government brought in a system that's structure that's based on a systems model, where the desktop assessment takes place once, and then there's monitoring, refinement, and there's compliance that applies to it. And what we've seen is that it reduces costs, it reduces duplication massively. You know, approved arrangements reduced cost on an Indonesian cattle shipment of feeder cattle to $3,000. So it's a meaningful change. But the other side of that is that when you do it well, you know, good regulatory principles can also deliver better compliance. And that's what approved arrangements did as well. It increased the clarity throughout the supply chain of what was required. And internally within businesses, they built clearer, stronger operational frameworks to deliver compliance. And so you've got that situation with approved arrangements where you have lower cost and improved compliance. It's pretty much exactly what you're aiming to get when you're doing regulatory reform or trying to set regulation up. So the other things you're trying to do, you want to try and structure regulation for efficiency, of course, and administer it for efficiency. So you want to make sure compliance should be easy. So you look at ways to align it with business processes or to automate it. You know, you do your income tax return now and the government will pre-fill the stuff they've already got from other agencies. So you minimise the risk that you stuff it up when you're transferring it across, or you make errors, or you get the figures wrong. It just makes it easier to do. And that's something that's easily done at the operational level or the regulator level. And then the other side is you have to make sure it's fit for purpose. Every regulatory thing that you're trying to do has different characteristics. And you have to make sure the system that you're putting in place actually matches up with those challenges and those characteristics. So you can put the roles and the obligations, the responsibilities where they best lie and where they best fit the situation. And so an example that comes not from livestock export, but comes from, just normal life really. In New South Wales, they want car safety obviously as an objective, so they do car safety checks. You look at the regulatory tasks that they're faced with. You have 5 million cars in New South Wales, all across the state. To do those checks, you need specialised skills, expertise, equipment, infrastructure, and you need the space to do it, which in places like Sydney, it's a huge cost. So if you tried to do it directly as a government to achieve your objective, it would be impossible. It would be massive cost, massive inefficiency. So you have to look at different ways to deliver that. And if you look at this scenario where you're looking at car checks, you've automatically got mechanics sitting out there that already have the skills, they've got the expertise, they have the equipment, they have the land, and they've got the space to do it. They've got established relationships with car owners and the people you're trying to influence. They can fix problems as soon as they identify them, if they're decent. And they're spread under market forces. It's ideal. They're spread by market forces to the density of where the cars are. So you don't have a government trying to guess where they should best put things. It's just dealt with by the commercial forces. And so, the New South Wales government obviously looked at that and they put in place a solution where they built a regulatory structure using those garages, those mechanics, to do those checks. So rather than having the government directly doing it, they're using a party that's perfectly suited to it, and they just structure the arrangement around it to give them the confidence that they're getting the outcomes that they need and that society needs. So you've got regulation that's based on good principles, you've got it structured for efficiency. The other thing you want to achieve, of course, is when it's being rolled out, when it's being administered, you want it to be done according to best practice. And there's a lot of different aspects that go into that. The two I've got there, you want it to be done fairly, you want it to be done predictably. The key one's consistency. You want to know if you're operating in that space that you're going to be treated the same way as someone else. That if someone else does the wrong thing, the consequence there will be similar. And they're not always going to be the same, but you want to know that there is some consistency between them. You want predictability as much as is possible, that the decisions that are made will follow a certain process, that you have a clear understanding of how things will roll out. If you take this action, this will happen. And that helps you to invest in your business, that helps you to design approaches. And you want it to be proportionate, and that's both in terms of what you're actually requiring as well as compliance, obviously. So you want consequences to match with the severity of a situation. But even just in the design, with that New South Wales example, they don't require those checks for cars under 5 years. So, and that makes perfect sense because they're completely low risk. They're probably under warranty. It would be disproportionate to actually require that, and it'd be inefficient. So there's nuances through all of this where you've got to look at whether things are actually matching up with the risk and the characteristics you're trying to manage. So, to recap, you've got trade facilitation enabled by regulation. You've got cost, trade competitiveness issues. You try and fix that by applying good regulatory principles when you build the regulation, by structuring the systems for efficiency, and by having regulators administer that fairly efficiently, predictably. And it all seems pretty easy, except that it's not, because regulation necessarily, inherently sits in places that are difficult, where you've got multiple interests, often competing interests. You've got high stakes. You've got socially sensitive issues. You think about nuclear and radiation. You think about food safety, resource use for fisheries and forestry, air safety. OH&S, they're life and death things. They're managed, but they're not easy things to manage efficiently or well. So you've got challenges there. And you've also got the challenge that every situation is different. There's no off-the-shelf model that you can just drop in and know that that's going to work for an industry or a situation. And if you look at ESCAS, it's virtually unprecedented. There is no simple way to go, all right, well, this regulation will work perfectly all the time. So you've got a situation when you've got that happening where the regulated, they're learning day by day how best to regulate to the outcome that they want to achieve. And so, of course, in that situation, the other thing, of course, and with live export, any trade-related industry, almost any industry, is it's dynamic and it changes so frequently. You've got, for us, you've got new exporters, new markets, new vessels, new animals. The livestock exported now aren't the same as they were 10 years ago. Things change, they're dynamic, and you have to have regulation that can try and follow that. And if it's not reviewed and renewed regularly, you can just say that even the best regulation will end up being costly and inefficient. So it's important to keep going back to it. So to finish up, if we look at ESCAS and apply a similar approach as what we sort of went through with the cars, where you look at the characteristics and the challenges that you're trying to deal with to get the outcome that you want. And we apply that to ESCAS. The objective is to facilitate trade by ensuring animal welfare overseas. You've got 3 million head of livestock a year, 3 species, 38 exporters, 800 facilities. You've got more than 30 markets. And you think about the challenges inherent in that. You've got geographic spread. You've got different cultures, different beliefs, different drivers, different starting welfare standards. You're trying to affect change, behavioural change in post-sales environment. And all of that is leading to situations where inevitably there's inefficiencies and costs and impacts on how you can trade. So it's a space that needs reform. It needs to keep being looked at. And I guess that's the thing, is that ESCAS does a really good job, and has done a good job for a long time, bringing all of those elements together towards the outcome that we want to achieve. But you have to keep asking yourself the question, is there a better way to do this, to do any regulation without the frustration? And frustration, by that I mean without the inefficiencies, without inconsistencies, without duplication, without the competitive loss. So without trying to affect the outcome, you want the outcome to be achieved better, you have to keep asking that question, is there a better way to do this? And that's ultimately what I think our role as industry bodies are, is to ask that question and to keep working, looking for those solutions and those next steps. Thank you very much.